So day science is, and there are many other terms Nobel Prize winners have used for this, but basically it's the fictitious logical structure we give to what we found to make it all make sense. If you follow the recipe, you'll find the same answer I did, which allows the science to be replicable. But that's not how any scientist actually makes their discoveries. It's very much the way artists do. It's a lot of intuition. It can involve body thinking, visualization, pattern recognition, pattern forming in new ways, all sorts of interesting ways of thinking, which we never teach the students that people do. I mean, one of my wonderful insights was talking to Jonas Salk one day, and I said, "So how did you solve the problem of polio and get a polio vaccine?" He says, "I became the virus."
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Insight Edge. This is a podcast on how breakthrough insights are generated. My name is Vivek Banerjee. I'm the founder of Insight Dojo and the author of the book Insight Edge. In this series, I interview leading scientists, artists, business leaders, musicians, and creative thinkers on insight. Today, we are very lucky. We have Robert Root-Bernstein as our guest, who is a true polymath, an artist, a scientist, a historian, and a philosopher of science, and one of the world's leading thinkers on creativity and polymathy. It's personally also very significant because his book, Sparks of Genius, which I have here, which I bought 25 years ago in New York, which he co-wrote with his wife, Michelle Root-Bernstein, has influenced my career and influenced the way I work, the founding of my company, and the writing of my book. So I'm really happy to have him on this podcast. And today we will talk about his latest book. It's called The Arts of Eminent Scientists, which I've just finished reading. It is about the connections between art and science, but it has many lessons for all of us who want to be insightful and creative. So I'm delighted to have Robert Root-Bernstein on this show. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
Thank you. Very great. Very happy to be here.
Yes. So Robert, your background is really interesting. You've worn multiple hats. You've been an artist, a scientist. You started off doing biochemistry in Princeton with Bob Langridge. Then you did history of science. Your PhD in history of science was Thomas Kuhn, and then you worked with Jonas Salk. And meanwhile, you've been doing art and you've been thinking about creativity and polymathy. Could you just talk about how, all the different things in your career and what have been the critical transition points?
Yeah. So I always wanted to become a biologist of some kind. Wasn't quite sure which type. Ended up becoming or taking biochemistry as an undergraduate because it combined chemistry, biology, all sorts of things, which pretty much is typical of the way I've thought about everything. Is I'm always looking at how I can keep my options open, something my father taught me. I was also always interested in art. Both my parents had a sort of scientific background. My father was one of the first computer programmers. My mother was a nurse and had a degree in psychology, ended up eventually working with people at UCLA as a research assistant in psychology. And they actually met in an art class. So they both made art. There was tons of art in always going on in the family. Basically anything my brother and I wanted to try out in terms of media was available. We both took music lessons starting in when we were very young and played instruments for about 10 or 12 years. So that was my background, and went to college, discovered that biochemistry was actually an extremely narrow field. Most of the people I met were working on one enzyme or one receptor for their entire lives. And I had grown up reading Charles Darwin and Louis Pasteur and people like that who had these huge theories and were integrating many, many different kinds of observations into them. And so I felt that I was missing something. I wanted the big picture. I knew you had to have the pieces, but I wanted the puzzle as it was put together as well. And so at the end of my undergraduate, I had a choice to go into graduate school in biochemistry. Um, Decided that really wasn't for me. I wanted that big picture more than I wanted the specific skills. So I had taken some courses in history and philosophy of science. I had two phenomenal teachers. One was Tom Kuhn, the other was a guy named Mike Mahoney. They were giving the big picture. And so I decided I would do something extremely odd, which was to get a degree in history and philosophy of science, and then somehow use that knowledge to get back into doing biology, now having the bigger context, the theories and so forth that had been developed, and maybe a better idea of what the big problems now were, where were the gaps. Uh, Very luckily, I could not get a job. It sounds somewhat odd, but in this case, not being able to find a job made me have to sort of think outside the box. So my father suggested just writing to a bunch of major CEOs at various companies or institutions and saying, here's what I did, here's why I did it, here's what I think I can do for your company that would be unique. Wrote to about maybe a dozen of them. Most of them never replied. A couple of them wrote back and said, well, you're very interesting, but I don't really know what to do with you right now. We'll get back to you if we have an appropriate opening. And very fortunately, Jonas Salk wrote back and said, I will be in New York City, just up the road from Princeton. Meet me there. It was about a month later at his hotel. Took me to lunch, and 2 hours later, he hired me. So I ended up with a postdoc, which allowed me to get back into doing lab research in his laboratory. But at the same time, he was trying to set up a second Salk Institute. The one he was the founding director of was focused entirely on biomedical research, but he wanted to have another one that would look at basically human evolution, specifically looking at the evolution of science and art. So this was perfect for me, exactly what my background had prepared me for. So I went off and started working for him for a number of years, and that sort of got me into this whole art, science, comparing the two, thinking about what the similarities and differences are, and clearly part of that has to do with creativity, which is where that interest started.
It's really interesting. And one of the things I read or I heard while I was doing research on you was when, whilst you did your PhD with Thomas Kuhn, at some point there was a departure in terms of Thomas Kuhn's view was that you don't have these paradigm changes in art, and there wasn't such a big connection, while you thought that that was not true, and that led to a lot of the work and research. So I found that really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are actually two things that really stimulated what eventually becomes this, both sparks of genius and eventually the Arts of Eminent Scientists. One was when basically the first day in graduate school, the president of Princeton University gave a welcome to the new graduate students. And the one thing that I remember from his welcome was, you're probably all very talented, you have many interests. However, if you are going to succeed, you must now put on blinders and do one and only one thing for the rest of your life. And you can tell from what I've been talking about, that was not me. It was not my family. And actually sitting there, I realized this can't even be the president of the university because he was an economist, but being an economist doesn't give you sufficient skills to run a major university. You've got to have people skills and you've got to be able to see, the big picture and so forth. And, where did he get that from if he had put on blinders? So, step one, am I in the right place? Do I really want to be in graduate school? Those kinds of things. Fortunately, I got along really well with my advisor, Tom Kuhn. We could talk about just about anything. He loved to have a good debate. So, we would get into things and it was really fun. But he had written an essay on whether art had paradigms and whether you could have a revolution the same way you had in science, whether there was any accumulation of knowledge in art. And he had argued no, no, and no. No paradigms, no revolutions. There was no accumulation of knowledge. Artists just did whatever the heck they felt like doing. Um, so he put this into a book where I was sort of his assistant editor, and we were mailing this off to the publisher. And he asked me what I thought about the book, and there were some wonderful essays, but I said there's one really bad one. And he says, "What's that?" And since we were, on these great terms, I told him I really didn't like this final essay on art and whether it had paradigms because I thought any art historian would be able to just shred it. I was not an art historian, but I could give him lots of counterexamples to each of the ones he'd put in his essay. And he sort of encouraged me to explain. I got out, mailed the manuscript, got back in the car. He changes the subject and would never talk to me about it again. So I left with this huge hole, basically, of this person I really admire, who I had always thought I could talk to him about anything, and now he won't talk to me about this. So that became pretty much a focus for me. Did I totally miss the boat here? What kind of arguments could I make to bolster my position? And as I did my graduate work, almost everybody I was studying, we were looking at Louis Pasteur. Turns out to be this phenomenal portraitist before he gets really engaged in his science. You can see him using those skills, his observational skills, his ability to make things, make models, make the equipment he's building, and so forth. Um, so I began to literally just start looking for case examples, which would either tell me that this is typical or atypical. And eventually, what we ended up finding was basically that the really great scientists almost always have some kind of art going on, whereas the typical scientist, uh, much, much, much less likely to have these kinds of avocations. And eventually, my mother's research ended up integrating here because she was working with a woman named Bernice Ideson at UCLA who did the first long-term study of scientists and what made them successful. And they had 40 scientists. They uh, followed over 30 years, gave psychological tests, followed how many papers they published, when they got tenure, if they got tenure, all sorts of measures you can imagine. Tried to correlate them and basically found no correlations with what made them successful. Wasn't IQ, wasn't grades, wasn't number of papers, wasn't all sorts of things like that. But what we eventually did find was that their avocations were very predictive. So the top people, the ones who got in the National Academy of Science, there were 4 Nobel Prize winners, all had multiple musical art, those kinds of things, writing poetry, things like that, as their avocations. But more importantly, they all address the C.P. Snow two-culture divide and said it doesn't exist for scientists. The great scientists integrate everything they're doing. So they were very explicit about, when I'm doing my art, I'm thinking my science. If I am a musician and a astrophysicist, I will think about astrophysics in terms of musical patterns or things like that. And this is very different from the people who had very average careers, barely got tenure. They would say, yeah, I have a hobby, but it's a way of getting away from my work. It has nothing to do with it. In fact, it's a distraction. If only I could work 14 hours a day, I'd be so much more successful as a scientist. Again, very different from the very successful scientists who literally every one of them said, I'm a lazy son of a bitch, or some of it, variant on that, which they weren't. I mean, they worked very, very hard. But what they would then go on to explain was that they learned how to walk away from a problem when it wouldn't resolve. If they just were not making progress, they knew the right thing to do was to walk away, do one of their hobbies, let their brain ferment whatever it does in the background there. And somehow or another, doing these other things would give them some clue, whether it was literally a clue because of something they were doing, or just releasing their brain to, in the background, solve the problem. So very, very different kinds of people doing very different kinds of work.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and the difference from the mainstream way of thinking. Uh,
Yeah.
and that itself is such a big lesson for most people because I think this whole idea that I have to focus on one thing and put all my hours trying to do that is perhaps the dominant paradigm in society these days. And,
Yes.
uh, so getting on to this, that's a great segue into the book itself. So could you talk about what motivated you to write this book? Because it's really a fascinating book. It has all these stories and it also has the artworks of these
Yeah.
scientists. So what um, motivated you to write this book?
Well, so part of the studies I ended up doing were as I would run into people like Pasteur um, or Frederick Banting, who discovered insulin. Turned out that in his spare time he would paint. Eventually became one of the actually best known painters in Canada, and had intended to retire at age 50 to become a full-time painter, but unfortunately died in a plane crash. As I learned about each of these people, I would see if I could locate any of the artwork. Um, that was combined with also trying to figure out why they did it. So, it's very nice to say that somebody does artwork, but if they can't tell you why they're doing it or if it has connection to the science, then it's hard to actually think about why. Is it just something to get away from their work, as I said before, or something that integrates into their work? So a combination of trying to find the artwork and also self-explanations of why it was important to them. This is not something you just go off and do. One, there are no grants for it. There was when I started all this work 40 years ago, there was no place to publish most of this work as well. Um, but it became a hobby. It would be something which, for me, was a way of, when I was not making progress in my science, I had something I could go off and do that was fun. And it definitely fed into the way I was thinking about things because it's giving me models, if you will, of very famous people, very successful people, how they worked, why they did what they did, which is always a great way to learn strategies for your own work. So I would do this, and whether it was reading, getting online to just fiddle around, put in scientist who's an artist, or whatever it happened to be. Um, some of them, if they're still alive, I would write to and say, "Can you tell me anything about your artwork? Are you willing to share any of it?" Because I give lectures on these kinds of things. When I was traveling, I would drop into archives if I was at Oxford. Oxford has these great archives. Cambridge has these great archives. Harvard has these great archives. So drop in, ask the people there whether they knew of any art in any of the archives of this famous scientists they had. Some of the archivists were just tremendously helpful, I have to say. In some cases, it was necessary to contact family to get permission to use these. The families would then turn out to have, oh, we have our own collection. So the Braggs and Thompsons, for example, allowed me into their home. They actually invited me in to allow me to take photographs of the works that they had there from their famous ancestors and things like that. So over the years, I accumulated more and more of this artwork and the stories that went along with them. And the problem was then what to do with it. Uh, on a number of occasions, I sent out proposals to various publishers, most of whom thought I was crazy. Where do you sell this book? Is it an art book? Is it a science book? We don't know where to place it. So the economics of book publishing became a problem. Uh, color books are expensive, and I really wanted to have a color book. Fortunately, Dr. Fua, who founded World Scientific Publications, when I wrote to him, got very excited. He had been trained as a physicist and knew lots of famous people who, through his physics, were also artists. And so he saw immediately what I was trying to do. And very fortunately, a couple of years ago, said, yes, I'll give you a contract. We'd love to have this book. So I sat down and spent a year pulling everything together and putting together the book.
That's amazing. And I almost find it so surprising that there'd be resistance to a book like this because I see it
Yeah.
totally differently. I feel like every school should have this book. I've been telling my wife, who's a physics teacher, to start a physics club where the students can actually take a physicist, read from this, do more research, and present it back. It's such a great way of stimulating this kind of thinking. And not just schools and educational institutes. I feel any company any individual who wants to be creative. I mean, this is such a
Yeah.
such great stories here, and that's what I found really fascinating. And so that's why I was so interested in the process because there are so many different scientific fields. So you have genetics, but then you'll have quantum electrodynamics, and then there'll be some other field. So you'd have to probably go into everything and understand the origin of the idea, and you're almost having to empathize completely with these scientists to be able to figure out how they got their ideas and how art influenced
Yeah.
them. So
Yeah. So this is definitely where my odd polymathic background became very useful. So um, working with Kuhn, he had been a physicist. His work is all on quantum mechanics. I had taken quantum chemistry as an undergraduate against the advice of my advisors. And why do you need that? But I just felt that if I was going to understand molecular interactions, I had to understand the basic science behind that. I had taken evolutionary biology. I'd taken lots of different kinds of sciences. And fortunately, one of the most interesting things that I have found in working with all these different scientists and trying to understand their stories is that the greatest science is always simple. I mean, that sounds wrong because you think about Nobel Prize winning science as being the cutting edge and terribly complex and so forth. And at some level, it really is. I mean, quantum mechanics itself is very difficult to understand. You have a lot of math and things like that. But the principles behind it are always simple. And if you think about, we can teach basic genetics, Mendel, the structure of DNA, all that kind of thing to a fifth grader. And they can understand the basic way in which things work. They won't understand all the details. They won't understand all the science that went into telling you how it works. But the principle in the end is really simple. And that's so different than most of the science. I think this is another really important lesson that allows the science to integrate with the art, is the art that they're dealing with is also based on basic principles. And again, getting back to Kuhn, it isn't just an artist doing anything they want. Artists actually invent rules, they invent techniques, they invent methods. And that's what these scientists key in on, how they can use the art and the methods and the techniques and the materials in novel ways, which is also how they do their science. So there are sort of these intimate connections just built in there.
Fantastic, absolutely. And one of the some of the themes that come out, I'd like to kind of talk about that. One is a consistent theme that comes out about when you read about all these scientists, that they actually think of the artistic and art and science process as very, very similar. It's not very different. It's not that art is and science are at different kind of poles. In fact, they talk about it as a common creative process.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
you kind of expand.
So I mean, yeah, I think the problem with lots of science education is that we give students what Francois Jacob, who's one of the people I feature in the book, um, a we give them the picture of what he calls day science.
Science, the night science, yes.
So day science is, and there are many other terms Nobel Prize winners have used for this, but basically, it's the fictitious logical structure we give to what we found to make it all make sense. I probably run into half a dozen Nobel Prize winners who have called scientific papers fraudulent in the sense that none of them explain how you actually made the discovery. What they do is they give you a logical explanation of if you do this, 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 and this, then of course you will get whatever the answer is. And that it's like a recipe in a book. You know, if you follow the recipe things, you will get a nice cake or cookie at the end of it. And that's really what you want to do for your fellow scientists. If you follow the recipe, you'll find the same answer I did, which allows the science to be replicable. But that's not how any scientist actually makes their discoveries. It's very much the way artists do. It's a lot of intuition. It can involve body thinking, visualization, pattern recognition, pattern forming in new ways, all sorts of interesting ways of thinking, which we never teach the students that people do. I mean, one of my wonderful insights was talking to Jonas Salk one day, and I said, "So how did you solve the problem of polio and get a polio vaccine?" He says, "I became the virus, and I wanted to know how it worked." And I'm like, "Why did no one tell me that this is what people do?" And then I started looking, and there's a guy who won a Nobel Prize, Chandrasekhar, for black holes. And he said, "I became a neutron star to understand what it was going to do or want to do." And the more I studied, the more I came up with these strange ways of thinking. So some of that ended up in sparks of genius, where my wife and I tried to sort of distill this into 13 what we called thinking tools: observing, imaging, patterning, analogizing, body thinking, playing, these kinds of things. And it was interesting because when I ended up writing The Arts of Eminent Scientists, many of these scientists actually used that terminology. Yukawa, who was a Nobel Prize winner in quantum physics from Japan, would talk about virtually all of the tools of thinking that we had talked about, analogizing and patterning, things like that, as being absolutely essential to how you think about things, and that the intuition, this building that Jacob talked about, literally inventing imaginary worlds and then comparing them with the real world. But you had to have an idea of how you thought the real world should work
Right.
in order to then be able to explore new possibilities about how does it actually work, or to solve the problems where you don't understand what's going on. You just imagine, well, what if this happened? What if that happened? But until you use that imagination of what if, which is the night science, build that world which might or might not exist, you have no way to then test the real world against it.
Yeah, right. That's another thing which I found really interesting about the book, that how people have articulated um, about process. Interestingly, the first thing I wrote about was day science and night science. Then Duhem saying that he wants to understand nature and not pass through life, and not pass through it, and therefore he avoids highways and Kodak, right? Uh,
Right.
and then Van 't Hoff talking about imagination being the building material for hypotheses. Waddington talking about how you need to look at demanding art, and that is so that you actually have to work on it and you'll reach your internal depths, and that will kind of loosen your kind of mental shackles, right? So
Yeah, and several of the scientists specifically said they develop manipulative skills. So if you're an experimental scientist, uh, you need to be able to make the material you're working with do what you want. And very, very often that requires a huge amount of practice, the same way that an artist learns to draw, to learn to use a scalpel or to manipulate some kind of machinery to get the answer that you want. Can be a very, very similar process. And the scientists that I write about literally said that, it is the same thing, and I can develop the same set of skills in either one, observing the same way. Artists obviously are very, very excellent observers, and the scientists said that the art actually would help them to learn to observe more acutely.
that was another really interesting aha moment for me, because I thought about observation and visualizing and imagining, but the amount of emphasis on building dexterity, manipulating things, and coming up with creative methodologies, that's another theme that keeps coming up. And also, when you were talking about the sparks of genius thinking tools, so it seems that's where there's a lot of variation. So, like what you were talking about, like Chaton and Campbell and Wishaus, they're all getting into the beauty of whatever they're studying. The whole thing about Campbell's looking at the beauty of parasites, and then having a painting like Vincent van Gogh's Sunflower. It's
Yeah,
called Vincent's Worm. It's And then writing poetry from a parasite's point of view. It's just fascinating. And there's stories like that, about the protests for Chaton, right? And
yeah,
and on the other hand, then you have people like Kekule who are doing it through three-dimensional thinking and visualizing structures, or Duchenne who's looking at abstraction. That while there are these common sort of benefits, there are also these very different ways people are
right.
having their breakthroughs.
Yeah. So certainly one of the messages of the book is there is not one way to use art and connect it with science. And I think probably I didn't actually try and break it down this way, but I'm guessing that the theoreticians probably have a slightly different set of uses than the experimentalists. Experimentalists are going to observing, manipulating, things like that are more important. The theoreticians probably abstracting and patterning, things like that are more important. But I think it really comes down to one's proclivities in the first place. What one thinks is beauty. So another interesting part was almost everybody talked about the beauty of what they did, something which again nobody ever taught me in any of my science classes. Nobody ever said, "Wow, this system is just so beautiful," or "working with this particular organism is just incredible," or "when you solve this equation, look at the beauty of how it portrays the universe," or things like that. They never used that language. But when I talk to my colleagues, they all use that. That's why they became a scientist. So one of the messages of the book really is we're missing something in our education for students in exempting this night science, because that's where the beauty is for these scientists. and that's what drew them in. And I think if we're not giving that to our students, we're not getting them to understand why a scientist wants to be a scientist. It's not just problem solving and getting the 16th decimal place exactly right. If you want the 16th decimal place, it's usually because there's something really beautiful about the way you do the experiment or the way you calculate it or whatever it is that gives you a new insight, an aha moment about the universe. And just telling students that the 16th decimal place is there is like boring. Who cares? Unless you give it this motivation in human emotion.
So that was another thing. Yeah, so many people just kept talking about the beauty, as you say, and beauty is not just the beauty of the science, but also beauty as a criteria. Like
Mhm.
I think it was Wilson who said about the aesthetics being a kind of guide, and even Heisenberg talked about that. And then there's this whole bit about serendipity, which comes out very strongly. And I found that so fascinating about the serendipitous influence of art on scientific ideas and back also art. And for instance, the whole
Sure.
thing between Escher and Penrose, right?
Mhm.
And was
Yeah. I was also not really expecting how the number of the discoveries that link to each other. Um, I had not expected that there were actually sort of schools. So Kekule ends up training Van Hoff. And I mean, each of these people is sort of working in a similar area. They're both artists, or they both are thinking about three-dimensional or atoms and molecules in three dimensions for the first time. Um, Chaton having, oh, I mean, he trains a whole series of Nobel Prize winners as well as a whole bunch of other quite successful scientists, all of whom are artists, sculptors, and so forth. So there's something about people who meld the art and science that attracts each other. Also, people who work together, collaborators, and so forth. Many of them showed up in the book.
like Eric Wieschaus and Nuslin Woolard, they're Christian,
Right?
because they seem to be working on the same thing at the same time. They're working on they are both artists, and both of them are featured
Exactly.
in the book. And the thing I found really fascinating is the aperiodic tiles of Roger Penrose influencing the quasi crystals,
Right.
Dan
Discovery.
Shetman, and
Right.
so not only is it going totally, Dan Sheckman's discovering something which is totally against the orthodoxy of that time and getting into this debate with Linus Pauling. And
Yeah.
then this idea is coming from Roger Penrose, which is helping him. And other things which I found talking about building on the serendipity is getting to the real stories, like the Kekule story about the Gorlice murder is so interesting about the serendipity.
Yeah, I was hoping, just as a historian and a writer, that I was not going to just repeat stories everybody knew. Obviously, one of the fun things is if you can come up with insights which nobody had had before, or interviewing the scientists. So the Kekulé story of him dreaming in front of the fire and seeing the snake eating its tail and suddenly coming up with the benzene ring is so well known. I don't really want to just repeat that. That's boring. So I did a lot of research trying to see if I could find other accounts or more information about it. And yeah, so one of the stories, as you just mentioned, was this idea that a story that was told in one of the families who had been trained by Kekule, one of the Nobel Prize winners he had trained, had passed down this story of how there was a whole other uh, way in which the idea had come to him, and so I include that in the book. There were other interviews I did, for example, with Joachim Frank, where he did all sorts of really interesting kinds of art. And as I tried not to, if I was actually interviewing a person, to try and lead them into what I wanted. So I don't take notes. I didn't record or anything, but he was sitting there just explaining how he made his major invention. And he says, yes, and basically it was just an insight I had because of my artwork. And I was just sitting there going, wow, I didn't even ask him that question, but he just
That is
spoke it out. And for him, it was there. And that's what's really exciting, is be able to add that into the story.
Yeah, I mean, what I found fascinating about the Kekule story was that if he hadn't been called for that to be a witness to that Gorlitz murder, he may not
Right.
have been a chemist because he got impressed by
Yeah.
Liebig out there, and then he
Yeah.
has this that object, the entwined snakes, and
Yeah.
which may have been
Which turns out to have been a ring that the woman who was murdered was wearing, which I had never seen anybody mention before. So, I mean, there are fascinating things when you start digging in and saying, okay, but what's behind that? What's the other story?
But that's the really interesting theme that comes out. It's both the combination of being purposive and serendipity. So then
Yeah.
but his maths and his art and architectural background allowed him to play with visual structures of chemicals and molecules, and that probably also may have eventually led to a dream. And another story, which is of Alexander Fleming, which is absolutely
Yeah. That was one of the most interesting to have dug up. So Fleming, of course, was famous for discovering penicillin, and supposedly it just lands on a plate that has streptococcus on it, kills off the bacteria, and so he knows he's got an antibiotic. And the problem is that we know that that can't happen if you already have your bacteria growing on the plate. The penicillin doesn't do anything because penicillin prevents the building of the cell wall around the bacteria, but once it's there, it has no effect whatsoever. So you can't have the penicillin just suddenly landing on the plate and killing off the bacteria. So when I was writing another one of my books, Discovering, I was trying to figure out by going through people's notebooks how they actually did the work. And what I discovered was that that story has no backing in Fleming's notebooks at all. There's nothing there that says yes, one day, this stuff appeared. But what it does show is that he was trying to actually experiment with all sorts of bacteria and fungi and all sorts of fun things to see whether they had something called lysozyme. So he had discovered lysozyme when it did serendipitously drip onto one of his plates when he was a young man and destroyed some of the bacteria. And it turns out that this lysozyme is in all of your tears and your nasal mucus and your sputum and all that kind of stuff. And it's one of our standard antibiotics against many kinds of bacteria. But unfortunately, it has no effect on pathogenic bacteria like strep and staph and things like that. So Fleming was very interested in seeing what kinds of organisms had things like lysozyme, and actually set up an explicit experiment when he found this beautiful colored fungus, which Penicillium notatum, to see whether it had lysozyme. And the backstory here is, why is he looking for these brightly colored bacteria and fungi? And that's because he made bacterial paintings.
things.
And this was just one of his weird artistic hobbies, possibly taken up because he wanted to get involved in a art group, which would only allow you to be involved if you were an artist.
The Chelsea
Uh,
Arts, the
Chelsea Arts, right? And So, I think he just started painting these bacterial paintings because it was fun. It also turned out to be extremely important in his discovery because uh, when he tested his Penicillium notatum to see whether it had lysozyme activity, he knew exactly, because he had tested literally thousands and thousands of samples of all sorts of bacteria and other things, exactly what it should do, which was nothing on the pathogenic bacteria such as strep and staph. So when it did kill them off, he knew that he had something very, very special. So it wasn't just, oh, it appears it kills them off, I discovered antibiotic. He knew he had found a new kind of molecule that somehow was killing off pathogenic bacteria specifically, which was definitely something of interest. Not at all what he was expecting. So another story of serendipity.
It's a,
Um, and now he can, he then in his notebook starts following it up. So eventually he is able to demonstrate that this is in fact a novel material which has novel properties, and um, that then becomes our first antibiotic.
yes, it's to think that the significance of that to the world and how
Yes.
art helped in that. The Serendipity plus is kind of deliberate testing for 10 years of.
Another story for just to back up on science funding. He'd never be able to do this today. uh, you know, he would have to be able to get a grant to fund his laboratory, and he would have to show progress every 6 months that he's actually getting the results he claimed he was going to get. And in this case, he had no idea what he was looking for. He was simply playing, and it takes 10 or 12 years of playing before he comes up with something significant. Same thing with Mendel, who's not in the book, but Mendel had to spend about 10 years simply growing pea plants and seeing which traits grew. Um, you know, they kept replicating each year before he could actually start his experiment. No one would pay you to spend 10 years simply preparing to do the experiment. So I think we're unfortunately probably losing a lot of really interesting phenomena because we don't allow people to play for long periods of time, or bring in these serendipitous discoveries.
And what is driving that?
So the major reason I think is, especially in the US, is that we have government funding. Same thing I've seen in the UK. People want to know that when they're investing government money, that they will get a payback from the investment. Unfortunately, the discussion of serendipity is very relevant here because most major discoveries are made by serendipitous means. You can't plan them in advance. If we could plan them, we wouldn't have any problems making discovery. We would simply predict something and go off and find it. Unfortunately, almost everything that really is interesting is something we didn't predict. And what it really comes down to is discovery is gambling. And I don't think that governments understand that it is gambling, that what you have to do is invest enough to stay in the game and play long enough that you can reap a really big reward at some point. But you have to be willing to lose a lot to get there. And that's the reality. And governments don't like to lose their money. A lot of the discoveries I have in the book are took place in places like Germany, Austria, so forth, where scientists are often hired with a guaranteed set of money, which allows them to work for extended periods of time, and simply follow their nose, follow the serendipitous leads, play around a bit. And I mean, certainly, for example, I talk about Novoselov, who with his group discovered graphene, for which he got the Nobel Prize. Had tremendous impact economically, and just literally hundreds of different kinds of inventions based on this new material. And he said basically it was simply the Friday afternoon, let's play result. And every Friday afternoon, they just do something unusual something they're not funded to do, something that probably won't work, but let's see what we get. And out of those little games, they occasionally get a huge breakthrough. And one of them was this graphene, which is literally worth hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of products today.
And that story comes out so strongly in the book about the role of serendipity. And again, I was thinking to even benefit from serendipity, art kind of helps probably in two ways. One is you're kind of exposing you're getting exposure to a different field, but also you are so much more receptive to spot
Right.
something. You have to be receptive, otherwise you can just pass through. Um,
Yeah.
so you need good observation skills, for instance. Um,
Yeah.
so it
And,
that
and part of it is an open mind. There's no way to, validate that except you read the stories and you get the sense that all these people who I talk about have a very open mind. They're very exploratory. They're interested in many things besides just their specific research topic. And that is very different than most of my colleagues. I have many, many colleagues who I've bounced ideas off of, and they go, yes, but is it fundable? Or no, that doesn't fit into my program, or answers like that. And that's, I think, inhibiting discovery, because when you're locked into this, I have blinders on, and this is what I have to do, and this is what I'm an expert at, the really interesting stuff just keeps passing you by.
and the one of the things that is very striking that all these people are polymaths. They're bringing their full personalities into the work, and even the way you talk about your work, like you talk about your parents and the influence of your parents. And I know that you've worked with Michelle, your wife, on this, in who's a historian and a haiku poet. And so it seems to be a very personal endeavor, right? For all these scientists, most of them have been very influenced by their parents. Some have been influenced by their wives. So it's a very striking theme that it's not a job. I'm sure you get this question: is it just an kind of more an inherent personalities, or is it something that can be developed? What do you think of that?
So I think many of these people were like this, just if you want to call it naturally. But when I say naturally, it's because of the way they were raised. I mean, a lot of them were raised in families where, or education systems where you were expected to be very well-rounded. That certainly was the case in talking about uh, Tominaga and some of the other Japanese, Yukawa. The Japanese educated elite were expected to be able to do artwork and music and understand history and literature and so forth. And I think when you're trained that way, there are at least a number of people who are going to start seeing connections between things. And I think because these people can do that, they become a model for how we could then learn to teach that. So one of the things that my wife and I have done is to look at something called the STEAM movement in the United States. It's also called Science plus Technology plus Arts in the UK. I mean, there's another group called SEED, Science, Engineering, Art, and Design. So there are various ways people are putting these things together. Now, we've looked at curricula that have attempted to integrate, say, art with science or art with engineering in school systems. And what we found is a lot of those curricula are not successful. They don't work. It's just somebody let's let the kindergartners dance the rain cycle. Why? I mean, they never explain why, except that, dancing and science, right? We put them together in some way. Um, it's not clear that the students get anything out of these combinations. So yes, you could give students a art class and then give them a microscopy lesson. How many of the students will take what they learned from the art and say, oh, I can use my observational skills and now draw better what I see in the microscope? Turns out very, very few of them. However, the curricula which do succeed in doing this are very explicit about, I'm going to teach you how to observe better and how to draw what you observe better, because you can use this in any field whatsoever. So when you go into your biology class, think about that whenever you're observing something and use the same skills. If you tell students that they should do this, then most of them actually will do it. So what the people in my book are doing is they've been very explicit about being able to do this. We ended up calling this networks of enterprise. They want to take everything they know. They want to find the skills or the methods or the techniques or the principles or whatever it happens to be and connect things. For whatever reason, they're built that way, probably because, like me, they grew up in a family which just somehow did this, right? But we can, obviously, from these curricula, use that lesson and say, here are some good exemplars, people who have done this very successfully. You can do it too, maybe not at that high level, but you can learn how to observe better. You can learn how to image better. In fact, there are whole curricula on teaching people how to see in their minds. And it turns out simply by teaching them how to see better in their minds, they become better at math and science, especially if you tell them, try to see the picture in your mind. Try to imagine what's going on when I ask you, how is this particular system working? Build the system, see it operating. Now, when you look at the equation or you look at the material and how the experiment is actually performing, imagine in your mind how it got there. And I have definitely run into scientists who said, yes, I was taught how to do that. So yes, I think we can do it. I don't think in general that we do.
Do that. And so here
Yeah.
you're saying that you need to make the benefit explicit to the
Yep.
students so they have an awareness that this is what they're learning and they should take it to
Yes.
the other thing.
So I mean, an example. I had a friend in college who was really brilliant in an academic sense. He was getting A pluses in all sorts of classes, and this is in the introduction to Sparks of Genius. So you've read this, but basically, at one point he walks through the door of the physics building, which is this huge oak door. Pushes on the door, it doesn't open. Pushes on the door, it doesn't open. And I opened the door then without any problem. Now he's about 6 inches taller, a lot heavier. So why am I able to open the door without any problem and he can't? And I'm like, okay, so we just had this in physics. What's the principle? He's like, I don't understand. I'm like, you're joking. You just got an A plus on the test. I got like a B. Why is it you're not seeing this? And we go back and forth for a while. He really didn't get it. And so eventually I had to say, where did you press on the door? He said, the middle. Where did I press on the door? The edge. Why does that make a difference? Still doesn't get it. So I say torque. He trots out the equation in his head, plugs in all these, so if the door weighed this much, oh yeah, it'd be so much easier if to press on the edge of the door. And what I found was that he was connecting nothing that he did in his life.
Yes.
He'd never used a wrench. He didn't realize that wrenches use torque. He didn't, I mean, there were all these things which people who just do things would connect, and he didn't. So brilliant in the sense that if he knew what equation linked to what problem, he could always solve it.
Yes.
But give him a real world problem and ask him what physical principle applied, he had not a clue. And I think that's the problem with the way we're teaching, is a lot of it is literally disembodied. I mean, he did not have a body sense of what he was learning.
But I see that in music a lot. for instance, I study jazz. I mentioned it probably in an earlier conversation. And sometimes we have these very good discussions on harmony, but you can see that for some people, it's become a completely mathematical, cerebral experience, and they're not hearing the sound. So,
Yeah.
um, so it becomes a big thing that how do you give people the experience first, and or let the experience lead, or give them that intuition of the senses, and let the theory follow, right? So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. There's a wonderful example. One of our colleagues who's doing elementary school education. They were trying to teach students the basic idea of um, how to balance objects. So make a mobile. So you're going to have, one size object over here, another size object, a fulcrum, and there's a basic physics equation that you can use to explain the length of the object and how far it is and how much it weighs and so forth. And so what they found was there were sort of three groups of people. There were ones who always understood the equation, but couldn't build the mobile. And there were ones who could build the mobile, but could not understand the relationship to the equation. And there were the ones like your son who would sit there and say, "Oh yes, this is how you build it." They could build it, and then they can explain how the equation applies to the way that they built it. And that's what we really need to be trying to do. And I think that that's one of the key things that the art does is you have to make something. Whether it's an art or craft, you make something, you manipulate things, you take something from your imagination and you make it real in some way, whether it's on paper or music or whatever it is you're doing. And that translation process gives you the ability to then link theory with actual doing of things.
yeah. So can we talk about the whole concept of polymathy a little bit, and
Sure.
how to make it? I mean, everyone covered in the book is supremely gifted. It's hard to kind of deny that if you see their
Yeah.
contributions, and the environment may have played a role. But how do we get that this whole idea of immersing in multiple fields in for ordinary people? Because I feel the benefits are a lot. So, do you think that's doable? Um,
Yeah, again, I do. I think, again, the mistake is that we have tried to educate people by saying you need to learn, say it's English, math, history,
yeah, yeah.
social studies, whatever. We've already divided everything up
Yes. Okay.
from the very beginning. Interestingly, looking back at my elementary school, this was not the case. We would be given, maybe they called it geography. I don't know what they actually called it. We'd be given an assignment to draw a world map, and then we'd have to place all the names of the different countries. And, this is all freehand. And then add in where is the capital of each one, what is the main agricultural product, what is the main, all these different things. So what we were really learning was we were learning drawing, we were learning geography, but we were also learning basic economics. We were learning, things about their culture, all sorts of other things all at the same time. I don't know how or why that was the case at that time, but I was really lucky to get that. So one of the places that has one of the best education systems is Finland, and this is pretty much what they do in their system, which is they focus on the local economy and use whatever resources they have there at that particular town in that particular region. So if it's fishing, it's one thing. If it's forestry, it's another thing, so forth. And anything that you learn in depth is going to connect to everything else. I mean, if you're doing fishing, you have to understand the fish. You have to understand the biology. You have to understand ecology. You have to understand the economics of it. You have to understand how you fish. So, I mean, that's a whole another thing that even if you understand the economics, the actual going out in a boat and catching the fish and processing them is a whole nother set of things, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So you can now learn everything about your world, and it's going to connect to all the rest of the world simply by learning something specifically. And I think the mistake we make is instead of finding out what students are most interested in and what they really like to do and building from there. If you're a musician, you can learn the theory. Once you learn the theory, you can start into the math. Once you get into the math, right? And then there's the economics. One of the things that I found really interesting in reading about the Beatles was how incredibly successful they were. And yet, despite the fact that they didn't understand the economics, they didn't understand how to copyright or protect their work. They made huge numbers of mistakes. And when they finally, I forget which of them, started a school, they insisted that their musicians learn all of those things. They had to learn every aspect of the musical industry and how it connected to advertising, everything else, because in order to be successful, it's not just about making the music. It's about selling yourself, understanding how people perceive you. I mean, all sorts of other things which, are not part of a standard music school curriculum. So I think we're actually teaching wrong. We're doing what my, university president said in grad school. We're putting blinders on people and thinking that the specific information for a defined field is sufficient for success. But true success, I think, requires you to always integrate.
Which is also an interesting point because people often make a lot of distinctions between specialists and generalists, but what you're saying that actually if you go deep even in one specialism, it will automatically connect to other fields, and you cannot be a master. And I very strongly feel that,
Yeah.
and that because any field is composed of so many interrelated things, right?
And the other mistake is doing it the other way of just giving you a broad, I'm going to give you the liberal arts education. I think it has the right idea, but it's done wrong. If I have a class in history, a class in English, a class in art, a class, each one's going to be given as if it's in its own little silo. And it's going to be very hard for most students to make any connections. So yes, it's good to have that breadth, but it's got to be a breadth that's born from some connection somewhere. There has to be a root from which all of this is going to connect.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the implications for the average person, a typical organization, might be lost by the way I did the book. I mean, I'm focusing on these extremely eminent, incredibly talented people. I hope people realize that many of those who are going to be reading it have those skills as well. They may have not have thought to connect them in those ways. So I actually did an interview not long ago with a couple of scientists, and one of them was, yeah, I do these things, but I never thought of connecting my music and composing with the way I do my science. So, there are a whole bunch of models here now for him to do that. So one of the things I'm hoping is I have lots of colleagues who are musicians and artists as well as scientists. Many of them have not connected the two. Many of them have never told their students about the beauty of the doing this of the science or how it is like the beauty that they experience when they're listening to a wonderful piece of music or things like that. I think many people would benefit from realizing that they too could integrate. I also want to point out that there are a fair number of Nobel Prize winners who were not stellar students. It's quite amazing how many of them were only good at maybe one thing, but had pretty average grades and everything else. There are a number who were not stellar students, period. I mean, they were not even considered good at their science. There's at least one Nobel Prize winner who has put up on his website a letter from one of his college advisors about this person will never make it as a scientist. He won a Nobel Prize. So, other people's evaluations of your potential are often, distorted by what we expect. And really interesting things that come out, whether it's in science or music or anything else, often come from left field, and it's the people you don't expect. So I really think that's empowering for many people. And as far as institutions go, um, I've done a lot of consulting for businesses, and um, we've talked about problem definition. I've repeatedly run into institutions where they have simply followed everybody else's lead in trying to solve a particular problem in a particular way without asking first whether it's the right problem, and second, whether what everybody else is doing is actually the right way to address that problem, or whether it addresses the entire problem. Um, so, that's important in terms of team building. We need experts. There's no doubt of that, and teams should definitely have experts. But another thing that I often had to do was act as an intermediary. And I think that's one of the roles that polymaths play extremely well. Different people with different expertises often have different languages. They define problems in different ways. They expect to use different kinds of tools. They're looking for different kinds of answers. And you often need a person who has enough understanding of each of the different specialties to be able to talk to all those people and to see that sometimes the differences aren't real differences, they're just language problems. Sometimes they're actual, approach differences, but a polymath is able to understand that there is an intermediate way, or a way to integrate the different approaches that will be more powerful. So using people who can do that polymathic integration, I think, is essential if you're going to actually look at any broad, wide world, wide problem, real world problem. And I think in industry, every problem is a real world problem. Again, like the Segway, they didn't understand their audience, who they were selling to, what it would be used for. There's a famous statement by a guy named Steinmetz, who was one of the people who really created the entire electrical infrastructure for General Electric way back in the 1920s and 30s, which made possible electric lights and all the things we take for granted. You needed those inventions, but you also needed the whole infrastructure to deliver it. And what he said was, if your invention failed, it's because you didn't understand who was going to use it and how they would use it. So, that requires people who go beyond just I can make a gadget. It requires people who understand the economics and the sociology, and maybe even the religion of people as to whether they're willing to adopt something.
And that's it's quite interesting. I thought back of when you were talking about a lot of these scientists were not top students. And then I was thinking back of the study you mentioned of the 40 Nobel laureates, and you said, it wasn't so correlated with the IQ, and it kind of was making me think, is creativity, to what extent is creativity and insight development correlated with IQ? I mean, anecdotally, I have this impression that
Yeah.
and then it's
So we actually looked into that at one point. So I have a paper somewhere on this. Basically, the field is pretty much agreed that once your IQ is about 115 or 120, there you have all the mental ability you need to be successful at pretty much anything. So there are at least 3 Nobel Prize winners who we know their IQs are in the mid 120s. So definitely you don't have, and that's the average IQ for a college graduate. Below that, there seems to be some correlation. There's a point, below 100 IQ where you just don't have the mental capacity to put things together in interesting and novel ways. But above that, there's no correlation whatever. I mean, above 120, you can have, be a Mensa member and have an IQ of 190 and literally have no idea how to make anything. And so that's actually fairly common.
That itself is probably a very empowering idea for many people, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you can
And
look at
again, the grades don't correlate. There is a study by some people in Israel which tried to look at who was successful in a wide number of fields, and what they found was that IQ, test grade, standardized test grades, grades in school, and all the standard things, SATs, those none of those correlated well with your overall success in a profession. But what did correlate was having at least one really intensive avocation. It could be, chess or inventing chess problems. It could be music. It could be, art. It could be virtually anything. But it was something which you had enough time and energy to put in, and in most cases, again, the ability to link those skills and that knowledge and those principles into your your actual work.
yes, and though again, it's slightly difficult to know about the cause and effect, right? I mean,
Right, exactly. Yeah.
uh,
Except, I mean, there is one argument that there is a cause and effect, and that is if you think about what creativity is, almost by definition, it's putting two things together that weren't put together before.
right,
So how do you do that if you are trained just like everybody else? I mean, basically, if you have the same training that everybody else has as an engineer, why would you have the capacity to invent a totally new way of solving some engineering problem?
right.
Whereas if you're also trained as an artist or a musician or a craftsman of some kind or whatever, there's certainly a higher probability that there's some principle, some material, some method or whatever that you're going to get from your avocation that you might be able to integrate into your engineering and say, here's an innovative way of looking at this problem, or even discovering a problem that you hadn't seen before.
Yeah, and I think you make that point that the processes are so similar or they're analogous processes in different fields, and sometimes that will actually trigger the insight, right, from one field to the other.
Yeah,
And
I even know people have made discoveries by punning,
yes,
which in it, what's a pun but connecting two things that weren't connected, but just sometimes as a joke, oh, that sounds like this is like this, and then they suddenly realize, oh, the joke isn't actually a joke; it's an insight.
what is your assessment of the current state of science?
Again, I think same problem in science I was discussing before with education. We've divided up into lots of little niches. I don't remember how many scientific specialties are now recognized. It's hundreds, if not thousands. Whereas you look back at the golden age of discovery, a lot of the people that are in my book, were working in the early and mid 20th century. Um, you could integrate lots of different sciences, and my wife and I did a study recently where we looked at all the Nobel Prize winners, not only in science but in literature and economics, peace. And what we found was there were basically two groups of polymaths. Everybody was a polymath. I mean, that was almost a given. But there were two groups. One were the ones that we've been talking about, which I focus on in my book, The Arts of Eminent Scientists, which are the ones who are doing art, music, things like that, and integrating that into their work. The others are particularly in the sciences, but this is also true in literature, for example, people who explored more than one science, many different types of literature, poetry, playwriting, novels, and so forth, short stories. unusually broad in their abilities and the kinds of things they were bringing together. So virtually every scientist who was not an artist had training in multiple scientific disciplines, biology and physics, chemistry and psychology, I mean, all sorts of strange combinations you wouldn't expect, which is where they then discovered interesting problems no one was working on, could bring new kinds of approaches that no one had thought of before. Same thing in literature. I mean, many of the literature people were also artists. So they're doing many kinds of literature, different kinds of arts. And now they're trying to say, how could I write poems in the same way that Picasso paints an abstract painting? Wow, what a weird thing to try to do. But this now breaks open a whole new way of writing that nobody had thought of before, things like that. So uh, the problem with the science is that we don't let people do much of that. There was an article that just came out in Nature a week or so ago where they looked at what they call disruptive discoveries. So these are the ones that are going to completely open up a new field or completely overturn the paradigm in an existing one. And basically, they found that these represented something like 5% back in 1940 and something like 1/10 or less of a percent today. And the actual rate of these has dropped by something like 95%. And I think what's happening, if you look at the data, is there's probably about the same number of disruptive discoveries year to year over the last century, but the number of scientists we have just doing what Kuhn called normal science every day, just problem solving in the same way as everybody else, is overwhelming those. So, I mean, if you go to a science conference, you'll find 95% of the posters and presentations are all on basically some version of the same problem. And then there's that 5%, which is actually different and interesting. And unfortunately, that's not what's getting funded. What's getting funded is controlled by the people who are doing the mainstream work. And so it's getting harder and harder for people to do that disruptive work.
So it's almost like, and then 5% probably is probably getting lost also in terms of
Exactly.
attention, and which again gets to this whole point about AI and the whole world of algorithms. And we know it's very powerful and there are lots of benefits. But what's your view on that? Like, how is that?
Oh, yeah. I think it's very much related. So the AI algorithms basically are looking for patterns, and the patterns are going to be the one that's the dominant one. That's going to look for the thing that makes the most sense out of the most data. Um, there are books about the black swan effect. I've done all sorts of different kinds of searches on AIs and about things which I know are very unusual and rare, but there's a literature because I found an article somewhere and I'm trying to find some new ones. So I ask Google, and the Google AI comes up with says basically there are no good articles or there are no connections between these two things. And I'm like, well, I know there's at least one because I found it. And interestingly, Google will often show you that article as the first thing in its actual search list,
Right.
but the AI has told you there isn't anything, right? And that's because when it looks overall at the average, it can't find it. And so, I worry that this averaging of everything
Yeah.
is, first of all, a problem in burying things that are interesting in our black swans. And on the other hand, I think it's going to be self-developing. So AIs will find the average. It will tell you the answer. People will accept it, or they're going to write in particular style, or they're going to make a generalization. That then becomes part of the literature. And then the AI now is going to be citing itself in the next round, which will produce more things, which will then get introduced into the literature, which it's searching. So that, whatever its original answer is going to recycle over and over and become the dominant answer no matter what, even though it may not be correct.
Right. So, yeah, and then there's this whole, the things that we've been talking about, right? Serendipity and
Yeah,
all these things which are so fundamental and
yeah.
us
I
experiencing.
mean, there's another problem I run into, which is just how to search the literature. So I very rarely now find serendipitous articles. Sometimes I do, just because the search terms accidentally show up something I wasn't looking for. I always file those because I don't know how I'm ever going to find them again. But what used to happen when I was much younger was I had to actually go to the library to look at an actual journal to read the article. And in flipping through the journal, you had to go through and you'd find the articles on either side. Often you'd see the index and see everything that was in there. And I can't tell you how many really interesting phenomena I accidentally, serendipitously fell upon, which I would never have known about and would not have been able to include in my work had I not had to literally physically go through and see these things.
Right.
Today, because I put in keywords, I don't see them.
Yes.
And I wonder to what extent, that is inhibiting discoveries as well.
So for me, one of the most inspiring aspects about reading, this book has been that it made me suddenly, it reaffirmed uh, kind of a natural inclination I have to go deep in things I like, and um, and also the faith in celebrating our kind of human potential. And one of the quotes by Homi Bhabha is that I can't extend my life, but I can increase the intensity of my
Yeah,
consciousness, my human consciousness, by looking at art, poetry, music, science. And for me, that was, especially in this algorithmic world, I found that really inspiring. And it almost kind of gives you a permanent state of protection from
yeah,
what's happening outside. I don't know what do you feel about that, right? So,
yeah. No, so many of the people who I wrote about said that, it made them feel more human and more specifically that it wasn't a waste of time the way you might think about it, but it's actually building capacity. It's building the ability to see things and observe things and um, find problems you never find in any other way. So, as you say, going deeper and deeper doesn't necessarily take you away from what you should be doing because really working 14 hours a day doesn't make progress. You've probably done everything you're going to do in four, which, what most people don't understand. Just banging your head against a problem, working more on it often makes no progress. It's just a waste of time. And, conversely, I've heard from a lot of people I really admire. If you want to get a job done quickly and well, give it to um, the busiest person you know. And the first time I heard that, I thought, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
right.
But, a lifetime has said, yeah, I mean, that's true. If the people who are really busy and have many things going understand what the essentials are, they don't waste time on things that are not meaningful. They're using all of their experience and knowledge. And if they agree to do something, they do it really well because they also know how to do things really well. And somehow or another, they become more and more efficient by apparently doing many different things. Exactly how that works, I don't know. I'd love to be able to explain that, but it does seem to be true.
Thank you, Robert, for this wonderful conversation. It's been a real privilege to have you here on this podcast. And to all those who are listening and watching, I hope you've enjoyed this and this conversation has sparked new ways of thinking about insight. And one of the main messages is how to integrate various disciplines, activities, facets of life to create breakthroughs. And I would strongly recommend this book, The Arts of Eminent Scientists. It's beautiful and deeply inspiring with just remarkable stories. It's one of those books that I'll keep going back to again and again. It's an absolute goldmine of insights. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please share it and subscribe to this channel. And I look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Thank you.